On behalf of a grateful nation, we present this flag as a symbol of your honorable service.
Before the
Well done, sir.
cafeteria, before the tray, before the 31 children who would carry that Tuesday in their memories for the rest of their lives, there was a retirement ceremony at Fort Myer, Virginia, on a June morning when the magnolias were blooming and the honor guard's white gloves were so bright in the sunlight they looked like small flames. The Secretary of Defense read from a prepared statement. The citation listed 36 years of commissioned service. It listed theaters and commands in the specific language of distinction that the military uses to describe men who have done things that cannot be fully described. It mentioned 2 wars by name. It mentioned the Joint Chiefs by title. What it did not mention, what no citation ever mentions, was the particular weight of command. So the weight of knowing that the orders you give will determine whether people come home. General Caleb Reeves stood in his dress blues and received the folded flag and the handshake and the photograph with the secretary. He was 54 years old. His posture was the posture of a man who had not allowed himself to slouch in 3 decades. His face held the composed dignity of someone who had learned, somewhere around the age of 32, that the most powerful rooms in the world respond to stillness. His daughter was not there. She was 9 years old and in school in Georgia, and he had decided that bringing her to the ceremony, flying her up, pulling her from class for the kind of ceremony that meant nothing to a 9-year-old and everything to the men who had served beside him, was the wrong call. He would tell her about it later. He would find the right words. He was still looking for the right words when he drove to Caldwell Elementary School in Macon, Georgia, 11 weeks later, with a forgotten permission slip on the passenger seat of his truck. Her name was Simone. She had her father's stillness and her mother's eyes. Large, dark, the kind of eyes that processed everything visible and several things that weren't. She carried a sketch pad the way other children carried phones, always in her backpack, always accessible, the pages covered in drawings of birds and architecture and the faces of people she found interesting. She had been drawing her mother from memory for 2 years. Vivian Reeves had died of ovarian cancer when Simone was 7. The illness had moved fast. One summer she was at the kitchen table helping Simone with fractions, and in the following February she was gone. Caleb had been in the Pacific when the diagnosis came. He had flown home. He had not left again until after the funeral, and he had not left Simone for more than a week since. They had moved to Macon 8 months ago after the retirement, after the Pentagon apartment was cleared and the dress uniform was hung in the garment bag, and the question of what came next had to be answered. Caleb had chosen Macon because Vivian's parents were there, her mother Dorothy, who made biscuits every Sunday and called Simone baby girl in the voice that sounded most like her daughter. Her father James, who taught Simone to identify birds by their calls on Sunday morning walks. Caleb had chosen it because Simone needed roots, and roots meant specific people in a specific place, and this was the place where Vivian had grown up. Caldwell Elementary had a 4-star rating from the state board, award plaques in the lobby, neat hallways, engaged teachers, the appearance of an institution that took its responsibilities seriously. Caleb had visited twice before enrollment. He had spoken with the assistant principal. He had reviewed the test score data. He had done the research the way he had always done research, comprehensively, systematically, with the understanding that information gathered in advance was the only reliable protection against surprises. He had missed something. He knew that now. The data did not capture what happened in room 104 when certain children sat down. Ms. Patricia Lund had been teaching 3rd grade at Caldwell Elementary for 17 years. She was 51, methodical, consistent. Her classroom was organized down to the centimeter. She kept a seating chart laminated and updated. She had a way of speaking that was always polite and always slightly wrong. Precise words delivered with a tone that undercut them, like a door held open with 2 fingers rather than a hand. The children who heard themselves in her voice knew the difference. They always knew. Simone had been in her class for 6 weeks. She had said nothing to her father. She had said fine every evening at the kitchen table when he asked how school was. And fine was the word that Caleb had learned from decades of command and 2 years of single parenthood to treat as a possible intelligence failure. He had been watching. He had been filing. He had not yet found the correct frame for what he was accumulating. Now, the permission slip was for a nature walk on Friday, the kind of low-stakes field trip that third graders circled on their calendars and reminded their parents about 11 times. Simone had left hers on the counter that morning. Caleb had found it at 10:45, had set it on the passenger seat, had decided to drop it off over lunch, a 12-minute round trip from the house. He would be back before 1. He pulled into the Caldwell parking lot at 11:32. The secretary buzzed him through the front door. He signed the visitor log. The secretary pointed him toward room 104. He was walking down the hallway when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Simone's name. She was not supposed to have her phone during school hours. They had a rule. She had followed it without exception for 6 weeks. He answered. Daddy. Or her voice was the voice that only existed when something had broken through every layer of self-composure she possessed. The voice underneath the 9-year-old who had learned to be brave because her father needed her to be brave. It was a sound he had not heard since the hospital. She told him she was in the second-floor bathroom. She told him what had happened. He did not remember walking faster. He was simply moving, and then he was in front of the cafeteria, and then he was looking through the small rectangular window in the door at a room that was still caught in the specific arrested stillness of 30 children who had just witnessed something they did not have language for yet. He pushed the door open. The steel trash can sat beside the serving counter. The lunch tray was on the floor beside it. Plastic, blue. The chicken and the green beans, and the carton of milk and the small square of cornbread scattered across the linoleum. The food had slid and settled. Some of it was still. Across the cafeteria, seated alone at the end of a long table, was his daughter. She was not crying. She had not allowed herself to cry here in this room, in front of these children. Her chin was level. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her. Her eyes were dry in the way that eyes are dry when the effort of keeping them dry is the entire project. She saw her father in the doorway. Something in her face changed. Not a collapse, not relief exactly, but the specific expression of a child who has been holding something impossible alone and has just seen someone arrive who can help her hold it. He crossed the cafeteria. He sat down beside her. Yet he did not look at the trash can. He did not look at the food on the floor. He looked at his daughter. Her chin trembled once. Then she pressed her lips together and held them there. She said, I didn't do anything wrong. He said, I know. She said, I smell. She said, charity kids don't choose seats. He put his hand on the back of her head, once, briefly, the way he had done since she was an infant, when she needed to know he was there, without needing to turn around and confirm it. He said, look at me. She looked at him. He said, what she said about you is not true. None of it is true. You understand me? She nodded. A small nod, the kind that means yes, and also I am trying to believe you. He said, I need you to stay right here for a few minutes. Can you do that? She said, yes, sir. He stood up. He walked toward the cafeteria door. Behind the serving counter, the cafeteria aide, a black woman in her 30s named Deja Monroe, wearing her uniform apron and holding a pair of tongs she was not currently using, watched him cross the room. She had watched everything that happened in this cafeteria for the past 40 minutes. Her knuckles had gone white around the tongs when the tray hit the floor. She had not spoken. She had a son in first grade in this building. She could not afford to lose this job. She watched the man walk toward the door. She noticed his posture. She thought, I have never seen a parent walk like that. Room 104 was at the end of the first floor corridor, past the art room and the resource library. The door was open. Lun was at the whiteboard, a marker in her hand, working through a multiplication problem. 28 children sat at their desks. The room smelled like dry erase marker and the particular staleness of an elementary school afternoon. Caleb Reeves appeared in the doorway. He was in khaki pants and a gray polo shirt. No insignia, no rank, a plain watch on his left wrist. He stood in the doorframe the way he stood everywhere, squarely without performance, the stillness of a man who had spent decades understanding that authority was communicated through presence rather than volume. Lun turned from the whiteboard. She had expected, perhaps, a frustrated parent, the kind who arrived with raised voices and complaints that could be managed through the standard language of process and review. She had managed those conversations before. She had managed 6 of them over 17 years, and everyone had concluded with a closed file and a return schedule. She did not know who this man was, but something in the room changed when he appeared in it. She felt it in the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. And the marker in her hand stopped moving. The children at their desks looked up from their work and looked at each other and looked at the man in the doorway. Caleb said nothing for 4 seconds. Then he said quietly, "Ms. Lund, I need a word with you in the hallway." The quiet was the thing. The children felt it. Lund felt it. The quiet was not the quiet of someone who did not have anything to say. It was the quiet of someone who had selected precisely what to say and was delivering it at controlled volume, because controlled volume, in certain situations, carries further than shouting. Lund set the marker on the tray. She looked at the class. What she said, "Continue your work." She walked to the hallway. Caleb stepped back to let her pass. He closed the door behind them. They stood in the corridor. The hallway was empty. Somewhere behind a closed door, a class was reciting something in unison. He said, "My daughter is in your class. Her name is Simone Reeves. She is 9 years old. She came to school this morning with a packed lunch and her permission slip that she unfortunately left at home. I came to deliver the permission slip." He paused. "What I encountered when I arrived was my daughter sitting alone in the cafeteria beside a trash can that contained her lunch." Lund's jaw tightened. A muscle moved in her throat. She began. "There was a behavioral," he said, "I didn't ask you to explain." The sentence arrived with a weight that stopped her mid-sentence. Not shouted, not threatening. The voice of a man who has given directions in rooms where the stakes of being misunderstood were measured in lives, and who knows exactly what to do with a voice to make it fill a space without raising it. He said, "I am telling you what I observed. I am also telling you that it will not happen again." He held her gaze. "I am going to speak with the principal now. I am going to ask her some specific questions. What happens after that will depend on the answers." He turned and walked down the hallway toward the administrative office. Lund stood outside her classroom door. Inside, 28 children waited at their desks. The marker on the tray was still in the position she had set it. She had not said anything wrong. She had not raised her voice. But something in the architecture of the previous 3 minutes had produced a specific feeling she had not felt in this building before. The feeling of accountability that is not processed but present, standing in the hallway, looking back at you. Principal Donna Garrett was 52, a former reading specialist who had moved into administration a decade ago and had run Caldwell Elementary with the managerial fluency of someone who understood that a school was also a political institution. She had the practiced warmth of a principal and the careful neutrality of someone who had navigated parent complaints for 10 years and understood how to absorb them without changing course. She was not prepared for Caleb Reeves. He sat across from her desk and asked 2 questions. The first, "Is there a security camera in the cafeteria?" And she said, "I'm not sure that's an administrative." He said, "Yes or no?" She said, "Yes." He said, "The second question, how many formal complaints have been filed against Ms. Lund in the past 5 years?" A pause. The air in the office was very still. She said, "Parent complaints are a personnel matter, and I'm not in a position to." He said, "I would like a Form 12, the parent-guardian formal complaint document. Right now, please." She opened the second drawer of her desk. The form was in the second drawer, not the top. It had been accessed before. He noted that. He filled it out by hand. Block letters. He time-stamped each section himself. He photographed the completed form with his phone before he slid it across the desk. He said, "I want a copy of this countersigned and returned to me today." She said, "Mr. Reeves, I assure you we take these matters very—" He stood up. He looked at the plaque on the wall behind her desk. Georgia School of Excellence. Title IV, Model Compliance. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "I'll be speaking with district counsel and a private attorney by end of week. The cafeteria footage from today should be preserved." He looked at her directly. "That's not a request." He walked out. In the cafeteria, Simone was still at the table. She had opened her sketch pad. She was drawing which was what she did when she needed her hands to do something her mind could understand. The drawing was of the trash can. She drew it carefully, the proportions, the rim, the way it sat slightly askew from where it had been moved. She drew what went into it. She did not draw herself. Deja Monroe had been cleaning the serving counter. She had watched Simone sit and open the sketchpad. She had watched the girl draw with the focused, quiet concentration of someone who had decided to make something out of the day that had been made of her. She set down her cloth. She walked to the lunch line. She put together a plate, chicken, green beans, cornbread, the same meal that had been thrown away, and carried it to Simone's table. She set it down in front of the girl. Simone looked up. Deja said, "I saw what happened. I should have said something when it happened. I'm sorry I didn't." Simone looked at the plate. She looked at Deja. 9 years old, processing an apology from an adult in the particular way that children process apologies that acknowledge something real, with the specific sobriety of someone who understands what the apology cost. She said, "It's okay. Summer, thank you for this." Deja went back to the serving counter. She stood for a moment with her back to the room, and then she picked up the cloth and resumed cleaning and decided what she was going to do. The camera above the cafeteria exit, a small dome mounted in the corner, angled toward the trash can area, had been recording continuously since the school day began. Caleb saw it on his way out. He photographed it. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 3 minutes. He called no one. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel and looked at the entrance of the school. He had spent 36 years in the United States Army. He had stood in rooms with secretaries of state and presidents and heads of foreign governments. He had managed crises. He had given the orders that moved troops across continents. He had never, in any of those rooms, felt what he felt sitting in this parking lot outside an elementary school in Macon, Georgia. He was a man who had protected a country. He had just watched his daughter sit alone beside a trash can that contained her lunch. He had watched her hold herself together with every ounce of composure she possessed, and he had known, in the specific way that fathers know things, that she had been holding herself together for longer than today. That today was not the first. That today was the day the phone came out. He called his attorney. Her name was Angela Birch. 47 years of age, civil rights attorney, Augusta, Georgia. 14 years of Section 1983 complaints. More Title VI actions filed against Georgia school districts than anyone else practicing in the state. She did not take every case, and she took this one before Caleb had finished the first paragraph. She said, "Is there footage?" He said, "There's a camera aimed directly at the area where it happened." She said, "I need you to do nothing that could be interpreted as evidence tampering. Take your photographs, file the complaint, go home. I'll file for the footage tomorrow morning under the Open Records Act and issue a preservation notice to the district by end of day." He said, "How long will this take?" She said, "It depends on what the footage shows and what the records show. Right now, I need the footage before the district decides to have a technology malfunction." He said, "Understood." He drove home. He picked up Simone from school at 3:15. She had her sketchpad in her lap in the passenger seat. She looked out the window on the drive home. She said nothing for 5 minutes. Then she said, "Is it going to be okay, Daddy?" He said, "Yes." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I'm going to make it okay. That's how I know." She looked at him. She seemed to consider this. Then she looked back out the window. After she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his phone and the photograph of the cafeteria camera, and he began the kind of work he was good at. Systematic, thorough, patient, with the understanding that the most important action is usually not the first one, but the one that comes after sufficient preparation. He was not in a hurry, but he was not going to stop. He sat at the kitchen table that night after Simone was asleep and opened a yellow legal pad. He drew 2 columns. In the first column, he wrote what he knew. In the second column, he wrote what he needed to know. He had been doing this since his early years in command, making visible the distinction between information in hand and information required. Because the gap between those 2 columns was where people made avoidable mistakes. The first column, Lund had dumped Simone's lunch. There was a camera. There were prior small incidents he had filed mentally. The principal had retrieved the complaint form from the second drawer. A prepared folder with a pre-printed label had been visible on the desk. The permission slip was still on the passenger seat of his truck. The second column, how many times before? Who had reviewed complaints? What the camera had captured? Whether the district had a pattern of closing complaints without investigation? Whether there were other families? He stared at the second column for a long time. Then he opened his laptop. Angela Birch's law office occupied the second floor of a narrow Victorian building on Cherry Street in Macon. The staircase creaked. The waiting room held 4 chairs, a table with a water pitcher, and 3 framed prints of civil rights case citations. Not portraits, not motivational quotes, but the actual language of landmark decisions framed as art. She had chosen them because they were the most honest decoration she could think of. The law said plainly, the words that had changed things. She filed the open records request on Wednesday morning. She filed the preservation notice to the district simultaneously, citing the specific Georgia statute that required the preservation of electronically stored evidence once litigation was reasonably anticipated. And the preservation notice was sent to the district's general counsel, the superintendent, and the principal by email. Each received a read receipt. By Wednesday afternoon, the district's general counsel, a man named Stuart Riley, who had handled Caldwell's legal affairs for 11 years, had forwarded the notice to the superintendent, a man named Howard Baines, with a single line, "They've retained counsel." Birch. Baines's response, which Angela Birch would eventually obtain through subsequent discovery, was 4 words. How long is the footage retained? The answer from the district's IT coordinator, 90 days, then auto-deleted from primary server. 60-day backup on cloud storage. Baines did not respond to that email. He did not forward it. He called Riley on the phone. Or Angela Birch's forensic technology consultant, a former federal agent named Marcus Webb who had spent 12 years doing digital evidence work and had seen the inside of more courtrooms than most trial attorneys, pulled the footage from the cloud backup server on Thursday afternoon. The preservation notice had reached the vendor before anyone at the district had thought to call them. 78 seconds, no audio. The cafeteria cameras at Caldwell Elementary did not record sound. Angela Birch watched it at her desk on Thursday evening. She watched it 4 times. The first time, as a lawyer, timestamps, camera angle, the relative positions of the teacher, the child, and the trash can, the deliberateness of the approach. Lund did not reach for the tray casually. The footage showed a woman who crossed to a table with purpose, who lifted a lunch tray with both hands, who walked 6 measured steps to a trash can, who inverted the tray with a clean, controlled motion, and who then turned and spoke to the child from a standing position while the child remained seated. The second time, as a mother. She had a daughter. She was 12. The third time, as a lawyer again, looking for the thing she suspected. She found it. Seated one position to Simone's left on the cafeteria bench was another student, a white girl with a braided ponytail and a pink water bottle. The girl's tray remained in front of her for the entirety of the 78 seconds. Her lunch was not touched. Angela checked the class activity log she had requested as part of the open records filing, and the log documented a worksheet assignment from that morning, a math drill that students were expected to complete before the lunch bell. She cross-referenced the log with the behavioral notation Lund had written on the cafeteria report she filed afterward. Lund's notation read, "Student Reeves, Simone, removed from preferred seating due to failure to complete morning assignment. Standard consequence applied per classroom behavior protocol. The girl with the braided ponytail had also not completed the morning assignment. Her name was in the log. Her tray was on the table. Angela Birch saved the footage to 4 separate locations. She texted Marcus Webb, 'Preserve everything. Chain of custody, I'll need a declaration.' On Friday morning, she filed for Caldwell's complete complaint and disciplinary records for the preceding 7 years, and was citing Georgia's open records statute. She also subpoenaed the district's Title VI compliance submissions to the U.S. Department of Education for the same period. What came back 9 days later, in a banker's box delivered to her Cherry Street office, was the architecture of something she had suspected and had never been able to prove in any specific district before. 7 years of complaint records, 5 files, each involving a student of color, each describing a variation of the same pattern. Food used as the instrument of humiliation, lunches discarded, trays confiscated, a child's meal held above the teacher's head in front of classmates in one documented instance, a child told to eat in the hallway in another. Each file bore a stamp at the bottom of the final page. Reviewed, resolved. No corrective action required. The stamp bore initials, H.B. Howard Baines, Superintendent. Angela Birch cross-referenced Baines's personnel file with the county property records database, the way she did with every administrator who had signed complaints involving the same teacher. She had learned to do this after a case in Augusta 7 years ago had turned on a relationship no personnel file disclosed. She found it in a county marriage record from 2003 and a death certificate from 2014. Baines's late brother had been married to Patricia Lunn from 1999 to 2011. This relationship appeared in no RUSD personnel document, no disclosure form, no conflict of interest filing. For 7 years, the superintendent responsible for reviewing every complaint filed against Patricia Lunn had been her former brother-in-law, and no one in the district had thought it necessary to disclose this to the families whose complaints he stamped closed. 3 families contacted Angela's office in the 2 weeks after word began moving through the Macon School Parent Network. The first was Renata Dawson, whose son Marcus had been in Lunn's class in 2020. The second was the parents of twin girls who had been made to eat in the hallway for 3 consecutive days in 2022 after bringing food Lunn described in front of the class as smelling wrong. The third family requested anonymity. Their child had since transferred to a private school. They were still afraid. Deja Monroe called Angela Birch's office on a Tuesday evening. She had gotten the number from a neighbor. She said, "I witnessed everything that happened to Simone Reeves on October 14th. I want to give a statement." She paused. "They cut my hours last week. I know why." "I don't care. I want to give a statement." Angela said, "Come in tomorrow morning. Bring your schedule records if you have them." On the same evening, an envelope arrived at Caleb Reeves's home. Hand-addressed, no return. He opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a single index card. Block letters printed. "Back off or your daughter has a problem in school every day." He read it once. He placed it in a clear sleeve. He photographed it under natural light. He drove to the Bibb County Sheriff's Office and handed the original to the duty officer. He texted Angela Birch from the parking lot. "Anonymous threat delivered to my home tonight. Original with sheriff. Photograph attached." She replied within 4 minutes. "That's the 14th piece of evidence. And add it to the chain. Do not stop." He did not stop. He had a conversation with Simone that weekend. She was at the kitchen table with her sketch pad. He sat across from her. He told her what was happening. Not the legal mechanics, not the filings, but the essential truth. He said, "What happened to you was wrong. Not just unfair. Wrong. And there are other children it happened to before you. I am trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone after you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if it takes a long time?" He said, "It will probably take a long time." She said, "And what do I do in the meantime?" He said, "You go to school, you do your work, you draw what you need to draw, you call me if something happens." He looked at her. "You let me carry this part. That's my job." She turned back to her sketch pad, and she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Daddy, did Mama know you were like this?" He looked at her. She said, "Like, that when something is wrong, you just keep going until it's fixed." He said, "She knew." She said, "I think she would have liked watching this." He smiled, just briefly. He said, "I think she would have had strong opinions about my strategy." Simone smiled too, small and real, and went back to drawing. The deposition happened in Angela Birch's conference room on a gray October morning. Deja Monroe sat at the table with her hands folded and gave her account of October 14th in a voice that did not waver. She named the time. She described Lunn's approach and the deliberateness of it. She described the sound of the tray hitting the trash can rim. She described Simone's face. She said, "I have worked around children for 9 years. I have never seen a child try to make herself that small." She was trying to disappear, and nobody said a word. She described 2 prior incidents she had personally witnessed. A boy in 2022 whose lunch bag Lunn had lifted from his hands and held above her head while she spoke about proper nutrition to the class. A girl in 2023 who had been directed to a table near the exit door, the table reserved in Lund's classroom culture for children who had not met behavioral expectations, and told when she tried to move that she could sit with the others when she learned how to behave in a school that wasn't hers. She signed 6 pages. Her hand was steady throughout. The retired teacher who called the following week had been at Caldwell from 2007 to 2019. Her name was Harriet Odom. She was 63, a former language arts teacher who had filed an internal complaint against Lund in 2018 after witnessing an incident in the hallway. The complaint had been reviewed by Howard Baines. The review had taken 6 days. Harriet Odom had been called into Baines's office and offered a restructured position that she understood, with certainty, to be a managed exit. She had negotiated early retirement instead. She had kept copies of every document. She brought them in a manila envelope and set them on Angela Birch's conference table. Angela looked at the dates. 2018, 5 years before Simone Reeves sat next to a trash can. She added it to the binder. The financial records came last, and they were what transformed a civil rights complaint into something the county district attorney could not ignore. And the forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Sewell, who had done federal grant work for 20 years, reviewed Caldwell's Title VI federal funding history against the compliance submissions. The Equity and Inclusion Excellence Grant, $900,000 per year, conditional on documented compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically the requirement that the district demonstrate an ongoing record of addressing reported discrimination incidents. 5 complaints existed in Caldwell's records. None had been substantiated. Each had been stamped closed by the man whose brother had been married to the teacher at the center of each complaint. Each annual compliance report to the Federal Department of Education for 7 consecutive years. Each bore the declaration, 0 substantiated complaints of race-based discrimination on record. Each bore Howard Baines's signature, 7 years, $6.3 million, his own handwriting on every certification. Angela Birch sat in her office with a complete binder, 4 inches thick, every tab labeled, every document dated, every chain of custody logged, and said to Caleb Reeves across the conference table, "This is no longer just about your daughter." He said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready for what comes next?" He said, "I've been ready since the parking lot." The hearing was in Bibb County Superior Court. Angela did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. She presented. The footage played on the courtroom monitor. 78 seconds of silence. Every person in the room watched a teacher lift a child's tray and invert it over a trash can. Some of the people in that room had children. Some of those children were 8 or 9 years old. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Catherine Marks, watched the footage without expression. She watched the girl on the bench. 8 seconds of footage remaining after the tray went into the can. Sitting with her hands in her lap and her chin level, and her eyes dry with the specific effort of a child holding herself together in a room full of people. She said nothing during the footage. The 5 complaint files, read into the record, dates, names, outcomes, the stamp, the initials, the conflict of interest. Harriet Odom's 2018 complaint and her non-disclosure agreement. The email moved the student, closed the file, the compliance reports. Some of the signature, the money. Renata Dawson took the stand. She described her son's face when he came home from school in 2020. She said, "He stopped eating lunch for 2 weeks. I thought he was sick. He told me he didn't want to be hungry at school because being hungry was better than being humiliated. He was 7 years old. The behavioral review targeting Simone, filed 3 days after Caleb had submitted the formal complaint, was the last exhibit. Angela placed it beside the anonymous threat letter. She did not call them retaliation. She let the dates speak. Judge Marks studied the documents for a long time. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. She said, "Emergency injunction is granted. Ms. Lund is removed from all classroom duties effective immediately, pending independent investigation. Watch, the district is ordered to preserve all records." She looked at Baines's attorney. "Any attempt to alter, destroy, or relocate documents will be treated as contempt of this court." She paused. She said, "I want to say one more thing for the record. A teacher's job is to hold a child in higher regard than the teacher's own frustrations. What is documented here is the systematic failure of that obligation, enabled by an institution that chose to protect its revenues over its students. The court takes that seriously. That afternoon, the Bibb County District Attorney announced grand jury proceedings, federal grant fraud, falsification of public records, civil rights violations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 7 counts, one for each year of signed certifications. Baines resigned before 5 o'clock. Garrett submitted her resignation the following morning. Caleb was standing in the courthouse corridor when Angela came out. She shook his hand. He nodded. He took out his phone and called his daughter. Simone answered on the second ring. He said, "It's done, sweetheart. You can go back tomorrow." A silence. Then, "Is she still going to be there?" He said, "No, she's not going to be there." Another silence. Then she said, "Daddy, was it about more than just me?" He said, "Yes. It was about 5 families before you and however many after if nobody did anything." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Okay. Okay. Good." He sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot for a few minutes after he hung up. The afternoon was cooling. I'm never in the light going that particular Georgia gold that happened in the late fall when the sun got low and everything cast long shadows. He thought about the parking lot at Caldwell Elementary 7 weeks ago when he had sat with his hands on the steering wheel and tried to understand what kind of place would do that to a child. He thought about the 5 files in the banker's box. The children in those files, Renata Dawson's son, the twins, the anonymous family, the others, who had come home from school and told their parents something happened and had filed a complaint and had received silence in return. Who had grown up in a world that told them the silence was the answer they deserved? He thought about what Simone had said a few weeks ago, that she thought her mother would have liked watching this. If Vivian had been a woman who believed that the clearest way to honor the people you loved was to refuse to accept a world that treated them as if they didn't matter. She had argued about everything and been right about most of it. She had taught Simone to draw because she said drawing was a way of saying, "I was here, and this is what I saw." He put the truck in gear. He drove toward Macon. He passed the school on the way home. Caldwell Elementary, the brick facade, the award plaques visible through the lobby glass even from the road, and he did not stop. There was nothing to stop for. The plaques were not his concern. What was his concern was a 9-year-old girl waiting at her grandmother's house with a sketch pad on her lap. She went back on a Monday. Her grandmother Dorothy drove her because Caleb had an early meeting, and Simone had said she wanted to walk in herself, which she did. She carried her backpack and her sketch pad and her lunch, which Dorothy had packed with the specific generosity of a grandmother who understood that food was also love, and that a packed lunch was a declaration. She went through the cafeteria line. She carried her tray to a table. She sat down. The new aide was a young woman named Miss Patterson, transferred from the district office. She smiled at the children when they passed through the line. She did not monitor where they sat. No one told Simone to move. She ate her lunch. She opened her sketch pad. On the blank page after the drawing of the trash can, after the drawing of the girl inside it, she drew something new, a girl standing, and both feet on the floor, arms at her sides, head up. She drew the cafeteria around her, the long tables, the institutional light, the doors, the corner where the camera was mounted. She drew all of it accurately, the way she drew everything, with the specific attention of someone who had decided that the world deserved to be seen clearly. In the corner of the drawing, barely visible, she drew a figure in the doorway, a tall man with his hands at his sides and his shoulders square. She showed it to her father that evening when he came to say goodnight. He sat on the edge of her bed and held the sketch pad. She said, "I put you in the doorway. You were there too." He looked at the drawing for a long time. The girl standing, the cafeteria around her, the figure in the door. He handed the sketch pad back. He said, "That's a good drawing, Simone." Oh, she said, "Grandma Dorothy says Mama could always tell when something was really right because it felt like it couldn't have been any other way." He said, "Your grandmother is right about most things." She said, "Does this feel that way to you? Like it couldn't have been any other way?" He looked at her. He thought about the parking lot, the phone call, the bathroom door, the tray on the linoleum. He thought about all the children who had sat in that cafeteria before her. He said, yes, this is the way it had to go. She closed the sketch pad. She lay down. He turned off the lamp. In the dark, before he reached the door, she said, Daddy. He stopped. She said, thank you for coming. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, I will always come, baby girl. That's the whole job. He pulled the door closed softly behind him. Outside, Macon was doing what southern cities do at the end of October. The air cooling, the last of the day's light disappearing below the tree line, a cardinal somewhere in the oak tree in the yard making the sound that made Caleb stop on the porch and stand still for a moment. He listened. He thought, Vivian, I'm doing all right. I think I'm doing all right. The cardinal sang once more and was quiet. He went inside.